Me, 38, tenured associate professor of gender studies at mid-sized university teaching courses on feminism, patriarchy, and social justice. Had strong feminist beliefs about rape culture and male violence, passionate about educating students on systemic nature of sexual assault. Posted frequently on social media about all men being complicit in rape culture through socialization into toxic masculinity. Believed that making male students uncomfortable with their complicity was a necessary part of feminist consciousness-raising education. Had been teaching Gender Studies 201, Feminism and Social Justice for 5 years with reputation for challenging male students directly. Course enrollment was typically 60% female and 40% male students required to take class for general education credit. Started semester with standard syllabus covering patriarchy, intersectionality, rape culture, and feminist theories of male violence. Third week of semester began unit on rape culture and male violence, focusing on statistics about sexual assault perpetration. Prepared lecture emphasizing that most rapists were men and that male socialization created culture enabling sexual violence. During lecture presented statistics showing that approximately 90% of sexual assault perpetrators were male according to research. Explained that rape culture was maintained through masculine socialization, teaching men that women's bodies were available for taking. That all men benefited from rape culture even if they personally never committed assault because fear constrained women's freedom. Male student named Tyler raised hand asking if statistics meant most men were rapists or just that most rapists were men. I said distinction didn't matter because all men were socialized into rape culture, making them complicit in system of sexual violence. Tyler seemed uncomfortable asking if I was saying all men, including men in this classroom, were responsible for rape culture. I said yes. Every man in classroom had been socialized into toxic masculinity, making them potential perpetrators of sexual violence. That statistically speaking, some men in classroom would go on to commit sexual assault, whether they currently recognized tendency or not. Another male student named Jordan asked if I was calling all male students potential rapists based solely on their gender. I said that's exactly what feminist analysis of rape culture meant, that male socialization created potential for violence in all men. That denying this reality was exactly the kind of defensive response that maintained rape culture and enabled male violence. Jordan said labeling all men as potential rapists based on gender seemed discriminatory and created hostile classroom environment. I said discomfort was a necessary part of consciousness raising and that men needed to confront their complicity in rape culture. That his defensiveness proved my point about men refusing to acknowledge their participation in systems of gendered violence. Several male students looked visibly uncomfortable, while female students seemed divided between agreement and concern. Continued lecture emphasizing that all men were socialized as potential perpetrators and needed to actively work against their conditioning. That men who denied being potential rapists were most dangerous because they hadn't confronted their socialization into violence. Class ended with significant tension and several male students leaving quickly without asking questions during office hours. Posted on social media about productive feminist lecture where I'd confronted male students with their complicity in rape culture. Got supportive comments from feminist colleagues praising bold approach to making men uncomfortable with their privilege. One professor commented this is exactly the kind of consciousness-raising feminist pedagogy that challenges patriarchal comfort. Another commented men's discomfort is sign you're doing important work forcing them to confront complicity they want to deny. Week after lecture started noticing pattern of male students being withdrawn and less participatory in class discussions. Several had stopped attending office hours and seemed reluctant to engage with material or ask questions during lectures. Female students reported that some male classmates had expressed feeling attacked and labeled as violent based solely on gender. I dismissed concerns saying discomfort was productive and that men needed to sit with feelings about their complicity. 2 weeks after lecture received email from Tyler requesting meeting to discuss concerns about classroom environment. Tyler came to office hours seeming nervous and said several male students felt targeted by characterization as potential rapists. That lecture had created an environment where male students felt presumed guilty of violence based solely on being men. I said guilt was appropriate response to learning about male complicity in rape culture and systemic nature of gendered violence. Tyler said feeling guilty about rape culture was different from being labeled potential perpetrator based on gender identity. That lecture had suggested all men, including him, were statistically likely to commit sexual assault, which felt discriminatory. I said if he felt discriminated against by facts about male violence that proved he was unwilling to confront his privilege. That defensiveness about being called potential rapist was exactly the reaction that maintained rape culture. Tyler left office hours seeming more frustrated, saying he'd needed to voice concerns about classroom environment. 3 weeks after lecture, Dean of College of Arts and Sciences requested meeting to discuss student complaints about my teaching. Said she'd received multiple complaints from students in Gender Studies 201 about hostile classroom environment. That several male students reported I'd called all men in class potential rapists, creating discriminatory environment. I explained I'd been teaching feminist analysis of rape culture and male socialization into potential violence. Dean asked if I'd actually stated that all male students were potential rapists based solely on their gender. I said yes. That was accurate feminist analysis of how rape culture functioned through male socialization. Dean seemed concerned, saying several students had reported feeling targeted and discriminated against based on gender. That university policy prohibited creating hostile environment for students based on protected characteristics, including gender. I felt defensive, saying feminist pedagogy required making privileged students uncomfortable with their complicity. Dean said making students uncomfortable with ideas was different from labeling them potential criminals based on gender. That several students were considering formal complaints about discriminatory hostile classroom environment. Asked if I'd be willing to clarify statements in next class session to address student concerns about being labeled. I refused, saying that would undermine feminist pedagogy and validate male students' defensive reactions to education. 4 weeks after lecture, received notice that 3 male students had filed formal complaints with Office of Civil Rights. Complaints stated that I'd created hostile discriminatory environment by labeling all male students as potential rapists. That characterization based solely on gender violated university's non-discrimination policy and Title IX protections. And that classroom environment had become so hostile that male students felt unable to participate fully in education. Most concerning was that complaint included audio recording of complete lecture where I'd made statements about male students. Recording captured me saying that all men in classroom were socialized as potential perpetrators of sexual violence. That statistically some men in classroom would go on to commit sexual assault based on their male socialization. And that men denying being potential rapists were most dangerous because they hadn't confronted violent conditioning. Felt shocked that student had recorded lecture without permission, violating my classroom trust and academic freedom. Called emergency meeting with university legal counsel to discuss complaint and recording that had been submitted as evidence. Attorney reviewed recording and complaint with serious concern, saying statements clearly labeled male students as potential criminals. That characterizing all men in class as potential rapists based on gender could violate non-discrimination policy. I said I'd been teaching established feminist theory about rape culture and male socialization, not making personal accusations. Attorney said feminist theory was protected, but applying it to label specific students as potential perpetrators was problematic. That recording showed I'd explicitly stated men in classroom would statistically commit assault based on their gender. This crossed line from academic theory into discriminatory labeling of students based on protected characteristic. Asked if I'd told Jordan his defensiveness proved he was dangerous potential rapist when he'd questioned characterization. I admitted recording probably captured that exchange during lecture about defensive reactions maintaining rape culture. Attorney said that was textbook example of creating hostile environment by suggesting students' objection proved violent tendency. 5 weeks after lecture, Office of Civil Rights opened formal investigation into whether I'd violated Title IX through discriminatory teaching. Investigation included interviews with all students in Gender Studies 201 about classroom environment and my teaching methods. Female students reported mixed experiences, with some supporting feminist approach and others concerned about blanket characterizations. One female student said lecture had made her uncomfortable because labeling all men as potential rapists seemed essentialist. Another said she agreed with feminist analysis but thought application to specific students in room had been too direct. Male students consistently reported feeling targeted, labeled, and presumed dangerous based solely on being men. Tyler said lecture had made him feel like professor assumed he was future sexual predator simply because of gender. Jordan said when he'd questioned characterization I'd suggested his defensiveness proved he was particularly dangerous. Another male student said classroom had become hostile environment where men felt they couldn't participate without being labeled violent. OCR investigator asked me directly if I'd characterized all male students in class as potential rapists during lecture. I explained I'd been teaching feminist analysis that all men were socialized into potential for violence through rape culture. Investigator asked if that meant I'd labeled specific students in classroom as potential future perpetrators of sexual assault. I said yes. That was logically consistent with feminist theory about male socialization and statistical likelihood of assault. Investigators said labeling students as potential criminals based on gender could constitute discrimination under university policy. That recording clearly showed I'd applied theoretical framework to specific students creating hostile environment. 6 weeks after lecture, Dean called meeting saying preliminary investigation findings suggested Title IX violation. That recording and student interviews demonstrated I'd created discriminatory hostile environment for male students. By explicitly labeling all men in class as potential rapists based on gender, not individual behavior or characteristics. And by suggesting students' objection to characterization proved he was particularly dangerous potential perpetrator. Dean said university was considering formal sanctions, including required training on non-discriminatory teaching practices, and potential suspension from teaching pending completion of investigation and remedial education. I felt outraged that feminist pedagogy was being characterized as discrimination when I'd been teaching established theory. Said feminist analysis of rape culture requiring acknowledgement that all men were potential perpetrators was academically sound. Dean said academic soundness of theory didn't protect labeling specific students as future criminals based on gender. That Title IX protected male students from hostile environment just as it protected female students from discrimination. Posted on social media about being investigated for teaching feminist theory about rape culture and male violence. Got intense response from academic feminists with very divided reactions to situation and my characterization of male students. Many colleagues defended approach, saying making men confront complicity was necessary, even if uncomfortable. One professor commented, "You're being punished for telling truth about male violence. This is academic freedom violation." Another commented, "Men's discomfort with being called potential rapists shows exactly why this pedagogy is necessary." But significant number of feminist academics questioned whether labeling all male students as potential rapists was pedagogically sound. One colleague commented, "There's difference between teaching theory of rape culture and labeling specific students as future perpetrators." Another commented, "Recording suggests you moved from academic analysis to discriminatory characterization of students based on gender." 7 weeks after lecture received final investigation report finding that I'd violated Title IX by creating hostile environment. Report concluded that recording and testimony showed I'd explicitly labeled male students as potential rapists based on gender. That statements had created discriminatory environment where male students felt targeted and unable to participate fully, and that suggesting students' objection proved dangerous tendency had compounded hostile environment. Recommended sanctions, including suspension from teaching for 1 semester and required training on non-discriminatory pedagogy. Also mandated that I issue written apology to students in Gender Studies 201 for creating discriminatory environment. Felt devastated that teaching feminist theory about rape culture had been characterized as discrimination against men, but couldn't deny that recording captured me labeling specific male students as statistically likely to commit assault. Started therapy to process investigation findings and understand what had gone wrong with lecture about rape culture. Therapist asked me to describe what I'd hoped to achieve by telling male students they were potential rapists. I said I'd wanted them to understand their complicity in rape culture and socialization into potential for violence. She asked if labeling them as potential future perpetrators had been necessary to teach theory about systemic rape culture. I was quiet because I'd conflated teaching about rape culture with labeling specific students as potential criminals. She said it sounds like you'd applied theoretical framework about male socialization to specific students in classroom. That teaching about rape culture could happen without characterizing individual male students as likely future assailants. And that recording showed you'd moved from academic analysis to discriminatory labeling based on gender. This was painful realization that I'd crossed line from teaching theory to making accusations about specific students. Started thinking about lecture and exactly what recording had captured me saying to male students in classroom. Had explicitly stated that all men in room were socialized as potential perpetrators of sexual violence. Had said statistically some men in classroom would go on to commit sexual assault based on their socialization. Had characterized Jordan's objection as proving he was particularly dangerous because he denied potential. Recording showed I'd applied theoretical claims about male socialization to label specific students as potential rapists. 3 months after lecture began suspension from teaching and mandatory training on non-discriminatory pedagogy. Training emphasized difference between teaching controversial theories and applying them to label students based on characteristics. That I could teach feminist analysis of rape culture without characterizing specific male students as potential perpetrators. And that suggesting students' objection proved violent tendency was retaliatory hostile response to protected expression. Instructor used my recorded lecture as example of how theoretical frameworks could become discriminatory when misapplied. 6 months after lecture attempted to return to teaching after completing suspension and required training. Department chair said several students had requested that I not teach required courses where male students would be present. That enrollment in my gender studies electives had dropped dramatically after investigation became public, and that university was concerned about potential liability if I created another hostile environment for male students. Asked me to teach only upper-level electives where students voluntarily enrolled knowing my teaching approach. This felt like punishment limiting my teaching assignments because I taught feminist theory about rape culture, but had to acknowledge that recording had shown me labeling students in ways that went beyond academic theory. Year after lecture published article about experience titled, I called male students potential rapists, and investigation followed. Detailed how I'd applied feminist theory about rape culture to label specific male students as potential perpetrators. That recording had captured me characterizing students as statistically likely to commit assault based on gender. And that investigation had found this created discriminatory hostile environment violating Title IX. Article got intense response from academics with passionate debate about feminist pedagogy and student protections. Many feminist scholars appreciated honest accounting, while others said I'd betrayed feminist teaching by admitting fault. One professor commented essential examination of where teaching theory becomes discriminatory labeling. Another commented your recording shows how rape culture analysis can be misapplied to target students. But some feminists criticized articles saying I'd capitulated to patriarchal investigation protecting male students. One blogger wrote author threw feminist pedagogy under bus by admitting calling men potential rapists was wrong. Another wrote investigation was retaliation for teaching truth about male violence, and you validated it. 2 years after lecture reflected on how recording had exposed my conflation of theory with student labeling. Realized biggest mistake had been applying feminist framework about rape culture to characterize specific students. That teaching about male socialization into violence was different from labeling students as potential rapists. And that recording had captured exactly the discriminatory statements investigation had found violated policy. Started consulting with universities about teaching controversial theories without creating hostile environments. Main message was that recording had shown me crossing line from academic theory to discriminatory characterization. That I could teach rape culture theory without labeling specific male students as statistically likely perpetrators. One consulting client had professor making similar generalizations about students based on demographic characteristics. My experience helped them understand difference between teaching about systems and labeling individual students. 3 years after lecture ran into Tyler, who'd requested meeting about concerns after lecture on rape culture. He said he'd felt dehumanized by being labeled potential rapist based solely on being man in classroom. That recording had validated his concerns, showing I'd explicitly characterized all male students as future threats. Investigation finding that lecture violated Title IX had vindicated his complaint about discriminatory environment. I apologized for labeling him and other male students as potential perpetrators rather than teaching theory appropriately. He said he'd appreciated apology, but damage from being characterized as potential rapist had affected his education. That he dropped gender studies major after lecture because couldn't trust feminist professors not to target male students. 4 years after lecture published book about experience wanting to help feminist educators avoid discriminatory pedagogy. Detailed complete story from lecture to recording to investigation to suspension and training. Included analysis of how feminist theories about systemic violence could be taught without labeling specific students. And framework for consciousness-raising pedagogy that challenged ideas without targeting students based on characteristics. Book became controversial but useful resource for feminist educators navigating boundaries of critical pedagogy. One reviewer wrote, "Essential guide for teaching rape culture without creating hostile environment through student labeling." Another wrote, "Author's recording of herself discriminating shows importance of maintaining pedagogical boundaries." 5 years after lecture reflected on complete transformation in understanding appropriate feminist teaching methods. Realized that recording reaching university president had forced confrontation with discriminatory application of theory. That labeling male students as potential rapists had crossed line from teaching to discrimination. And current reflection 7 years after telling male students they were potential rapists and panicking when recording surfaced. Learned that teaching feminist theory about rape culture didn't require labeling specific students as potential perpetrators. That Tyler, Jordan, and other male students had legitimate complaint about discriminatory hostile environment. That recording had captured me applying theoretical framework in ways that targeted students based on gender. That suggesting Jordan's objection proved dangerous tendency was retaliatory discrimination against protected expression. Most importantly, that suspension and training had been necessary consequences for creating discriminatory classroom environment. That's what I learned from calling male students potential rapists and panicking when recording reached administration. From believing discomfort was productive to understanding I'd created discriminatory hostile environment. From applying theory to students to teaching theory without labeling specific individuals as criminals. That's my complete story about lecture that violated Title IX when recording exposed discriminatory characterizations. 7 years after lecture continued consulting, helping feminist educators teach controversial theories without discrimination. Most impactful work involved professors recognizing themselves applying frameworks to label students based on characteristics. One professor had been characterizing all white students as white supremacists based on systemic racism theory. After hearing complete story understood that was discriminatory, labeling not appropriate teaching of theory. Revised approach to teach about systemic racism without characterizing specific students as racists based on race. Another professor had been labeling all wealthy students as oppressors based on class analysis theory. Worked with them on teaching about class systems without targeting individual students as oppressors based on background. 8 years after lecture published follow-up research on discriminatory pedagogy disguised as critical consciousness raising. Studied 150 cases where professors had labeled students based on demographic characteristics using theoretical frameworks. Found that applying systemic theories to characterize individual students created hostile environments across ideologies. That students had legitimate complaints when theoretical frameworks became personal accusations based on identity. Research validated that my lecture had been pattern of discriminatory pedagogy, not isolated feminist teaching mistake. Started training university administrators on distinguishing between teaching controversial theories and creating hostile environments. Main framework was that theories about systems could be taught without labeling individual students based on characteristics. First, administrators implementing training reported better outcomes, supporting academic freedom while preventing discrimination. 9 years after lecture, Tyler, who'd filed initial complaint, contacted me saying he'd completed gender studies PhD. That investigation validating his complaint had helped him trust that feminist education could happen without targeting men. He'd found professors who taught rape culture theory without labeling male students as potential perpetrators, and had developed feminist pedagogy emphasizing systemic analysis without discriminatory characterization of students. Thanked me paradoxically for negative example that had taught him how not to apply theory in classroom. Current reflection 10 years after calling male students potential rapists and panicking when recording surfaced. Learned that decade of work helping educators avoid discriminatory pedagogy had been necessary after my violation. That recording had captured exactly the line crossing from theory to discrimination that investigation found. That Tyler's complaint had been legitimate response to hostile environment created by labeling students as criminals. Most importantly, that feminist theory about rape culture could be taught without characterizing students as potential rapists. That's everything learned from 10 years since recording exposed discriminatory application of feminist theory. From defensive about investigation to grateful, it prevented me from continuing to create hostile environments. From labeling students based on gender to teaching about systems without targeting individuals. That's my final lesson about calling students potential rapists and learning why that crossed into discrimination. 10 years after lecture, continued consulting work helping universities prevent discriminatory pedagogy while protecting academic freedom. Most powerful sessions involve professors recognizing themselves applying theoretical frameworks to label students based on identity. One women's studies professor had been telling female students they were all victims of patriarchal oppression, requiring her guidance. After hearing complete story about how my recording exposed discrimination, she understood that was also targeting students inappropriately. Revised teaching to analyze systems of oppression without characterizing individual students as victims needing rescue. Her students reported feeling empowered by learning theory without being labeled helpless based on gender. Another critical race theory professor had been characterizing all students of color as traumatized by white supremacy. Worked with him on understanding that assumed individual students' experiences based on race rather than teaching about systemic racism. He changed approach to teach about racism's impacts without presuming every student of color was personally traumatized. 11 years after lecture, published comprehensive guide for teaching critical theories without discriminatory student characterization. Detailed complete framework distinguishing between analyzing systems and labeling individuals based on demographic characteristics. Included legal analysis showing how Title IX and non-discrimination policies applied equally to all students regardless of ideology. And pedagogical strategies for consciousness-raising education that challenged ideas without targeting students based on identity. Guide became required reading for new faculty at universities concerned about both academic freedom and non-discriminatory environments. Started mentoring young feminist professors specifically about teaching rape culture theory without labeling male students. One new professor wanted to begin gender studies course by having male students acknowledge their potential for violence. After our work together, she understood that would create same discriminatory environment my recording had exposed. Developed alternative approach teaching about rape culture systemically without characterizing individual male students as threats. Another professor had been planning exercise where male students apologized for patriarchal violence on behalf of all men. Helped her see that collective guilt assignment based on gender was discriminatory even when theoretically grounded in feminism. She revised to focus on understanding systems rather than requiring students to accept guilt based on demographic characteristics. 12 years after lecture, Jordan, who'd questioned my characterization during recorded lecture, contacted me. Said he'd become advocate for both feminist education and protecting students from discriminatory teaching practices. That my lecture had taught him two important lessons about feminist pedagogy done wrong and right. Wrong was labeling students as potential criminals based on gender, which recording had captured me doing. Wright was teaching about rape culture's systemic nature without targeting individual students based on characteristics. He'd used my case in presentations about balancing critical pedagogy with non-discriminatory classroom environments. Thanked me for eventually taking responsibility and helping other professors avoid creating hostile environments through theory misapplication. Current reflection 13 years after calling male students potential rapists and panicking when recording reached president. Learned that 13 years of helping educators avoid discriminatory pedagogy had given meaning to my violation. That recording reaching administration had forced necessary reckoning with how I'd crossed line from theory to discrimination. That Title IX investigation finding hostile environment had been appropriate because I'd labeled students as criminals based on gender. That Tyler and Jordan's complaints had protected future students from professors who might make same mistakes. Most importantly, that feminist theory about rape culture could and should be taught without characterizing students as potential perpetrators. That's my complete final reflection on calling students potential rapists, then panicking when recording exposed discrimination. From defensive about investigation to accepting that recording showed clear Title IX violation through student labeling. From believing all men were potential rapists to understanding that's theoretical claim, not characterization of individual students. That's everything from 13 years of reflection on recording that exposed my discriminatory application of feminist theory. From teaching that challenged students to teaching that targeted students based on protected characteristics. From feminist pedagogy to discriminatory pedagogy disguised as consciousness-raising education. That's my absolute final lesson about recording reaching president and forcing confrontation with discriminatory teaching I believed was progressive. 13 years later, grateful that recording existed because it prevented me from continuing to create hostile, discriminatory environments. That Tyler had courage to record and report protecting future male students from being labeled criminals in my classroom. That investigation found Title IX violation because I'd crossed clear line from teaching theory to discriminating against students. Most importantly, that recording's existence meant I couldn't deny what I'd said or claim complaints misrepresented my teaching. That's everything learned from recording that captured me violating students' rights while believing I was teaching feminist truth.